Now, many of us will know Matt from either his time here on campus, he was an alumni of the MA Biblical Studies program, or from other many conferences around, not least like CSBS, for example. After his time here, when he graduated, Matt went on to complete a second master's at Oxford, and then on to a PhD at Duke in 2010, around.
Yeah.
And since then, he has been a few different places, but now we're happy to have him back on this side of the border. He's the associate professor of religious studies at McMaster University. His work explores the intersections of ethnicity and identity construction in order to better understand how ancient Judaism and Christianity functioned as religions. His published works include Contesting Conversion, Genealogy, Circumcision, and Identity in Ancient Judaism and Christianity. That was 2011 with Oxford. And this book won the Manfred Lautenschlager Award for Theological Promise from the University of Heidelberg. As well as this past year, I think 2016, your most recent book, The Paul and the Gentile Problem.
I think that's right.
It seems like it was a long time ago. It's just out and has already won critical acclaim. His current research considers how the Synoptic Gospels present Jesus in relation to the Jewish laws of ritual purity, and here he's extending on the work of Mary Douglas and Jacob Milgram. So in many ways, this is a bit of a homecoming for you. Welcome back to the Canadian academic scene and to Trinity as well. It's good to have you. Please join me in welcoming Matt for his paper, A Leper in the Hands of an Angry Jesus.
Well, thank you for having me. I hope my voice will last. I'm catching a cold, and yesterday I talked more than I normally talk in a month. So we'll see how it goes. The last time I was here giving a paper, it was at my MA thesis defense. So I have less skin in the game now, but somehow the nerves are still there. Maybe they never quite leave. So as Andy mentioned, this is part of a larger book project on ritual purity in primarily the Synoptic Gospels. John doesn't seem too fussed, or at least he doesn't mention them too much except for corpses. Ever since the pioneering work of Geza Vermesh, has the handout gone around, by the way? Does everybody have a handout? Good, excellent. Let me start again. Ever since the pioneering work of Geza Vermesh in his 1973 book entitled Jesus the Jew, it has been common for New Testament scholars to emphasize that Jesus was, in fact, a Jew. At the same time, the majority of these scholars also assert that Jesus rejected a good deal of what was central to the Judaism of his day. For instance, Tom Wright speaks of, and I quote, a very Jewish Jesus who was nevertheless opposed to some high-profile features of first-century Judaism. Such scholarly arguments seem to boil down to the claim that Jesus was Jewish, but not that Jewish. My current book project aims to show that the Synoptic Gospels portray a Jesus who really was that Jewish, by focusing on one area in particular where scholars almost always conclude that Jesus really wasn't that Jewish after all: his interactions with those who were ritually impure. In this paper, then, I will re-examine the first ritually impure person Jesus encounters in Mark's Gospel, a man who has what Mark calls lepra. This single story, I will argue, stresses Jesus' desire to remove ritual impurity from those who endure it, a theme of central significance to Mark's depiction of Jesus. Let me begin with 5 brief observations about ritual impurity in ancient Judaism. First, according to the priestly legislation found in Jewish scriptures, there were 3 physical sources of what scholars commonly refer to as ritual impurity: genital discharges of blood and semen, lepra, of the Greek translation is lepra, and corpses. That's it. Second, contraction of this impurity was virtually inevitable. Israelites often had sex, they often had babies, and they buried their dead. One would naturally and pretty regularly contract ritual impurity through the course of one's life. Third, not only was it inevitable, it was also not sinful. Jewish scriptures confusingly use impurity language for a number of different phenomena, including wrongdoing or sins, what scholars often call moral impurity, but there is nothing inherently sinful about contracting ritual impurity from sex, childbirth, corpses, or lepra. At least, not usually. Fourth, the concern for ritual impurity, and where ritual impurity moved from simply ritual to include also moral impurity or sin, arose if and when the ritually impure person entered into sacred space, the tabernacle or temple precincts, touching the various sancta associated with sacred space. In other words, ritual impurity only became a problem when it encountered holy objects. The Synoptic Gospels portray Jesus encountering people who had lepra, a Greek word frequently translated into English as leprosy, and even I committed this moral impurity, the sin of translating as leprosy in the title of leper. I did that because no one would know what you would know what a leprosy is, but leper sounds a bit better. The term leprosy conjures up all kinds of dreadful images in the modern imagination that make unsurprising the fact that Jesus healed this man and others like him. Maybe we can all conjure up images of flannel board diagrams of Jesus and lepers. But the Greek term lepra in the Hebrew word zara'at, which it translates in the Septuagint, does not refer to the disease that we call leprosy today, Hansen's disease. While almost all English Bibles render this word as leprosy, which is really surprising since I think we almost all know it's not, this translation runs contrary to both archaeological and literary evidence. And I have a bunch on there, and I'm sort of going to skim over it, which suggests that leprosy did not exist in the ancient Near East until well after the composition of Leviticus. Although there is literary evidence of leprosy in 6th century BCE India, Greco-Roman literature repeatedly suggests that it was unknown in the Mediterranean world until at least the 3rd century BCE. Consequently, paleopathologists conclude that leprosy originated in India, spread to Egypt in the 3rd century BCE, and then into the Levant in Europe by the 1st century BCE. The internal evidence of Leviticus and Jewish scriptures more broadly confirms that lepra does not refer to leprosy. Most important for our discussion is the fact that Leviticus points to the existence of white flesh and white hair within that flesh as potential evidence of this ritual impurity. I'm not a doctor. Well, I am, but not that kind of doctor. Hansen's disease is never white, apparently. So a leper in the modern sense would never have been declared impure by the legislation of Leviticus 13 through 14. Further, the laws pertaining to lepra describe the rituals that Israel must observe if either clothing or a house becomes infected with lepra. Clearly, this is not a medical condition. Houses and clothing don't contract Hansen's disease. But what about Jesus' day? After all, as I noted above, leprosy did exist in Judea and in the Mediterranean world more broadly in the 1st century CE. We found some dead bodies that have Hansen's disease from 200 BCE in Egypt and 1st century CE in Jerusalem. When the gospel writers refer to lepra, do they mean to refer to leprosy? The answer in short is no. Greek writers like Hippocrates, Pliny, and Galen did not refer to leprosy as lepra. Never. Instead, they usually use the words elephas or elephantiasis, never lepra. On the other hand, they use the word lepra for a variety of apparently minor skin disorders. If the gospel writers intended to refer to leprosy when they mentioned Jesus' healings of lepra, then they were unique in the Greek-speaking world. So unique, in fact, that no one would have known that it was actually leprosy to which they referred. This would be a massive communication failure. It's actually in the 9th century that a scholar confuses lepra and leprosy and makes this misidentification, which persists to this day. But if lepra was not the medical disease leprosy, then why did the priestly community that composed Leviticus care so much about it? Why did Jews consider lepra to be a ritual impurity? Jacob Milgram provides, I think, a helpful clue or answer. The main clue for understanding the place of lepra, he states, in the impurity system is that it is an aspect of death. Its bearer is treated like a corpse. And he points to Numbers 12:12 and Miriam and 2 Kings 5:7, where lepra gets associated with corpse-like conditions. Josephus and later rabbinic literature do this as well. We'll return to this association shortly. But we can now turn our attention to the Gospel of Mark, and you have the text before you at the top. If lepra was little different from psoriasis, then why did the Gospel writers care to present Jesus performing a miracle that was roughly equivalent to using Head and Shoulders twice a week? This seems like a relatively trite miracle. Surely there were more, at least from our standpoint, surely there were more pressing medical conditions in the first century upon which Mark, Matthew, and Luke could have focused. The answer must be that Mark, Matthew, and Luke wanted to demonstrate Jesus' opposition not to the Jewish ritual purity system, as is so often the argument of New Testament scholars. Rather, these early followers of Jesus wanted to depict him in a way that showed his opposition to the very existence of ritual impurities like lepra itself. They're concerned about a ritual condition, not just a miracle, a medical miracle in general. Mark's story raises a number of interesting questions. Most importantly, why does Jesus appear to get angry when he encounters this man and hears his request? Admittedly, there is a considerable text-critical issue here, which you can see on your handout. Only a few and very minor manuscripts of Mark read angered, while the vast majority read having compassion. Most modern translations follow the latter manuscripts. Jesus had compassion. But as we all know, one of the principles of text criticism is that the harder reading ought to be preferred, all things being equal, since it is more likely that a scribe would remove a difficulty in a passage than that he would create it, unless he did so accidentally. Although the external evidence is undeniably slight, I'm convinced that here the harder reading is indeed preferable, and there actually is other external evidence to support it, and that comes from Matthew and Luke and their retelling of Mark's story. Both retell this story, and neither mention Jesus being angry or Jesus being compassionate. This silence suggests that the version of Mark that they had used probably had angered and not feeling compassion, since it would seem more likely that they would both omit the difficult angered than that they would both omit a reference to Jesus' compassion. Evidence that Matthew and Luke would feel inclined to remove this reference to Jesus' anger can be found in the way in which they remove Mark's references to Jesus' anger in more textually secure passages. And I think I have them on here, towards the bottom, and at the top of page 2. You can see some evidence there. So they remove these references to Jesus' anger in more textually secure passages, yet are quite comfortable referring to Jesus' compassion elsewhere. They like a compassionate Jesus. They don't like an angry Jesus, and they sure don't like an angry Jesus where it seems relatively irrational, unprovoked anger. The guy wants help. That's the title, in allusion to Jonathan Edwards. Given that both Matthew and Luke omit references to Jesus' anger in contexts where it seems eminently justifiable for Jesus to show anger, that is, in contexts where people resist his healing or where people try to keep kids away from him, it makes considerable sense that Matthew and Luke would omit a reference to Jesus' anger when it does not seem justifiable. Something about the encounter with this man has annoyed or angered Jesus, and Matthew and Luke don't seem to know what it is, and so omit it. But what is it in Mark? Scholars have suggested 4 possible things that might have angered Jesus. The man himself, the impurity the man suffers, a demonic presence connected to the disease, or the entire ritual purity system, which was deeply oppressive in some scholars' minds. Mark, unfortunately, does not tell us, at least explicitly. And such ambiguity no doubt helped give rise to the well-attested textual variant that describes Jesus as moved to compassion. I find the 4th suggestion, that Jesus is angry at the ritual purity system, the least plausible. If Jesus rejected the ritual purity system and the reality of ritual impurity in general, he should not have purified the impure man. Rather, he could have taught the man in the crowd that the system, I should not have printed this on 2 sides, that the system was exclusionary and encouraged them to consider the man pure. This coincides nicely with our own presumptions, this reading, but not with the ancient world. Rather, I find the first suggestion most likely, although I do not think it mutually exclusive of other interpretations. There are times when demons get associated with lepra and ritual impurity, so it's not implausible, but there's no mention of that at least. It looks like Jesus is angry at the man himself. Jesus' later actions, as you read on in the story, of growling at the man and expelling him, ekbalos, the verb Mark uses, from his presence, seem to confirm this reading. Jesus is agitated at him, and his actions are a bit brusque. Why? After all, the man comes to Jesus begging to be purified. And in his supplication, he even shows a great deal of faith by acknowledging that Jesus is powerful enough to purify him. That is not the question. The man knows Jesus can do it. Claims to know Jesus can do it. Later, rabbis would claim that it was as difficult to heal those suffering from lepra as it was to raise the dead. You can see this, for instance, in the Bavli Sanhedrin 47a, where Rabbi Yochanan says that it is the equivalent of death as it is written, "Let her," that is Miriam, referencing Numbers 12:12, "let her not be as one dead." To cure lepra is equivalent to raising the dead, and yet this man believes Jesus can do it. Mark does not draw attention to the man's faith here, even though the man clearly has no doubts that Jesus is able to perform such a deed of power. He's not commended for his faith like others are. He's cast out. Rather, Mark narrates the story in order to structure the encounter around the question of whether Jesus desires to rid the man of his ritual impurity. If you wish, if you desire, you can purify me. You are able to purify me. This is the central question. The man's doubts pertain to whether Jesus wants to remove ritual impurities, or whether he sees no reason to use his evident power to do so. In other words, the story as Mark frames it focuses on Jesus' attitude toward ritual impurity itself. The very fact that the man is unsure whether Jesus desires to remove the impurity demonstrates that Mark Jesus wishes to set the record straight on Jesus and ritual impurity. Presumably, the man gives voice to a question or criticism that Mark believes was aimed at Jesus or his followers. The man's uncertainty draws Jesus' ire, I think, because Mark believes it absurd that anyone would harbor doubts about Jesus' view of ritual impurity. For Mark's Jesus, ritual impurity is something real. It actually exists in nature. And it is of such grave consequence that Jesus does desire to purify those who suffer from it, becoming angry at the thought that anyone might question his desire here. His response again focuses the reader's attention on Jesus' desire. Jesus says, "I desire," or "I wish it, be purified." But Jesus' concern for ritual purity doesn't end there. Instead of telling the man that he is pure and can now resume his regular life in the Jewish community, Jesus casts the man away, telling him to show himself to the priest and to bring the offering required of those purified of lepra. Here, Jesus does not take upon himself the priestly prerogative of declaring someone pure or impure. Rather, he sends him to the priest for such a pronouncement. This fits with Qumranic concerns, which I believe are on your handout. It's been a while since I created it, which do not permit the better educated overseer to make such pronouncements, even if dealing with an ignorant or simple-minded priest. The priest makes the declaration. It also coincides with rabbinic concerns, which stipulate clearly that only a priest can declare whether the lepros has become pure. You can see this in the Mishnah. Like those at Qumran and the early rabbis, Jesus defers to the legislation of Leviticus 13 and 14, which states that the priest diagnoses and makes rulings about who is pure and who is impure. Leviticus 14, 2-7. Jesus, then, fits within this larger stream of Jewish thinking about the role of priests in dealing with lepra. Paula Fredrickson is right to conclude. This is an uncomplicated endorsement of a very elaborate sequence of ablutions and sacrifices detailed in Leviticus 14, by which the lepros moves from pollution to purity, from isolation back into life in the community. We've got a law-observant Jesus here, in other words, and one who cares about ritual impurity. Mark intends to show that Jesus is doing something related to but distinct from the priestly service. Nowhere in priestly literature or Second Temple Jewish texts do priests have the ability to purify lepra, or to remove lepra is maybe a better way to put it. Their God-ordained job is to diagnose, not cure. Consequently, Jesus' purification of the man is an astounding deed of power that Leviticus never contemplates the priests performing. But this fact does not necessitate the conclusion that Mark intends any criticism of the priestly caste or rejection of the ritual purity system. Already in Jewish scriptures, we see two cases in which a person suffering lepra is healed at the initiative of a prophet, not a priest. Miriam through the prayer of Moses, although some people think Moses is a priest and others don't amongst ancient Jews, and Aaron doesn't do it. And the Aramean Naaman through the actions of Elisha in 2 Kings 5. Neither of those texts are criticisms of priests, so why would we think this story is a criticism of priests, apart from Christian assumptions? Similarly, later rabbis make the following claim, and again, this is on the handout. In this world, the priest examines for lepra. Well, I'm giving you the Greek just because it's nicer to pronounce. But in the world to come, says the Holy One, blessed be he, I will purify you. Thus it is written in his quotation from Ezekiel 36:25, I will sprinkle pure water upon you, and you will be pure. From Leviticus Rabbah. The rabbis acknowledge the limited power of the priests in the face of lepra. Yet this is hardly a criticism of them. Rather, the remark serves to function as a hopeful expectation that one day God would address the root of ritual impurity itself in ways that God apparently had not intended the temple cult to do. Mark shares this same hope, but believes that Israel's God is now in Jesus purifying those with lepra. For the rabbis, the world to come is the world to come. For Mark, it's come. The kingdom is here. It's invaded, and the eschatological purification process has begun. In this story, then, Mark emphasizes Jesus' conformity to the legislation of Leviticus and commitment to the temple cult. They work in tandem. By placing this story early in his narrative and before the series of controversy stories in Mark 2:1 through 3:6, Mark aims to ensure that his readers will see Jesus' esteem for the Jewish law. 2,000 years of Christian interpretation suggests maybe he didn't do a good enough job. I'm not sure. In fact, these commands surely connect to and help to answer the question with which the narrative begins. Does Jesus desire to rid others of ritual impurity, or is he indifferent to the whole ritual impurity system? Consequently, the testimony that this purified man gives to the priests when he's supposed to go to the temple pertains not to Jesus' ability to rid someone of ritual impurity, but rather to his desire to do so. Through his interaction with Jesus, the former leprous has become pure. In showing the priests the tangible evidence that he no longer suffers from lepra, the man would have enabled the priests to see and acknowledge that Jesus is involved in a powerful purification mission. But he doesn't get there, and they don't learn this. Far from being indifferent to ritual impurity and angry, Jesus wages war against it. And it starts in Mark 1 and it goes through the narrative of Mark's gospel. And Matthew and Luke both pick it up. In Mark's depiction of Jesus' encounter with the man who had lepra, we see Jesus dealing with the root source of this man's ritual impurity, the lepra itself. Translations that render lepra as leprosy and thus interpret the story as a miraculous healing of a horrific medical condition inevitably conceal from modern readers what would have stuck out most clearly to Mark's ancient readers who were familiar with Leviticus and Jewish ritual purity, the miraculous purification of one who was formerly ritually impure. I have stressed that ritual impurity only becomes an issue when it encounters the sanctuary or temple. But in the book of Numbers, we see this exclusion of the ritually impure extend beyond these boundaries to include the whole wilderness camp. Interestingly, Mark portrays Jesus encountering the ritually impure in the same order as that found in Numbers 5. In Mark 1:40-45, he encounters one suffering lepra. In Mark 5:25-34, Jesus encounters a zavah, that is a woman with an irregular genital discharge. And in Mark 5:35-43, he encounters the corpse of a young girl. In each case, the ritually impure person leaves Jesus' presence purified. Coincidentally, I think this is really interesting. I don't know if anybody's observed this before. I haven't seen it. These three persons, the person with lepra, the woman with the irregular genital discharge, and the corpse, are, according to the Mishnah, the most powerful sources of ritual impurity. Jesus knocks out the strongest forces. I should say, I'll acknowledge, maybe it's on the handout, a bone fragment is in the middle of that list of three, but it's a corpse, part of a corpse. What the narrative arc of Mark's gospel suggests then is that readers must understand Jesus to be involved in a broad-scale purification mission. Mark portrays Jesus as a mobile and contagious power who removes impurities he encounters. Not only does he remove ritual impurities, though he also removes moral impurities or sins. Immediately after this, in Mark 2:4, he's explicitly forgiving the sins of a paralytic. This declaration understandably angers some of the scribes who wonder how a human can claim to forgive sins, something only God can do. So this gets to the heart of Jesus' identity in Mark. This question finds its answer in a story about Jesus' purification of yet one additional form of impurity, pneumatic impurity. Even before Jesus deals with the ritually impure or addresses the moral impurities of the paralytic, he encounters a man with a demon, or what Mark calls, repeatedly, an impure pneuma. As is common in Mark's gospel, the demonic frequently knows more than human characters do. Here, the impure pneuma knows Jesus' name and identifies him by the title, Hagios tou Theou, the Holy One of God. In this early incident, Mark mentions two of the primary categories of the priestly worldview, the holy and the impure. According to the priestly worldview, while there are four primary categories, holy, profane, pure, and impure, only two of these categories function as forces, dynamic forces, the holy and the impure. In Mark's narrative, then, these two forces, Jesus, empowered and driven by the holy pneuma, and himself the Holy One of God, faces off against impurity, all forms, pneumatic, ritual, and moral. Okay, this is an interesting ending. And he wins. Oh, there it is. There, facing off. There we go. Good. It's just like the ending of Mark's gospel. It just cuts off. Sorry about that. Let me pretend I know where I was. This true, yeah. Okay. Okay, I wasn't the end right there. This is the end. Okay, according to Mark's narrative world, Jesus is such a powerful and contagious force of holiness that he overcomes all sources of pollution. Because Jesus is the Holy One of God and powered by the Holy Pneuma, he must be opposed. In his nature, he's opposed to impurity in whatever form he encounters it. It is the very nature of the holy to be opposed to and averse to impurity. Holiness simply cannot coexist with impurity. This fundamental axiom of the priestly purity system explains Mark's portrayal of an angry Jesus. In his important study on ritual impurity and the historical Jesus, Thomas Thiessen frequently suggests that Jesus demonstrates what he calls laxity toward the Jewish ritual purity system. The reason for this supposed laxity, Thiessen concludes, is that Jesus was part of a moral trajectory which placed relative importance on ethics, which did not allow purity rules to intervene with social network, table fellowship, and community, because his eschatological outlook made impurity subordinate to the kingdom. This is Thiessen's claim. His conclusions suggest that Jesus and his followers thought that ritual impurity was, as a result of the inbreaking of God's kingdom, of lesser significance. It's not as important anymore. What I want to argue, and what I'm trying to do in this paper, is suggest that ritual impurity remains of considerable importance for Mark, but that God has introduced something new he's injected something new into the ritual purity system. By inserting a new, mobile, and powerfully contagious force of holiness into the world in the person of Jesus, Israel's God has signaled the very coming of the kingdom. A kingdom of holiness and life that throughout the ministry of Jesus overwhelms the forces of impurity and death, be they pneumatic, ritual, or moral. Throughout his narrative of Jesus' life, Mark repeatedly depicts Jesus overcoming impurity after impurity. This dramatic story culminates in Jesus facing off with death itself in his crucifixion, taking ritual impurity into his very own body, only once again and with finality to come out victorious. Thank you.